as well. Should I put my my slides up there now, Debbie?
Sure.
Okay. Let's fingers crossed that I can do this properly.
Perfect.
There.
We're good to go.
We're good to go. Well, thank you very much, Debbie, and Andrea as well, and to all of you for giving me the opportunity to spend some time with you this morning. Pretty important day in the world, and it's just really exciting to have an opportunity to talk with you folks about concepts and ideas that are really important to me and to lots of folks, and I think will be of help and relevance to you in your career going forward in the short term and in the long term. So I guess I'm going to say feel free to ask questions or raise comments as I go along. Otherwise, I'll just carry on. How would that be? So a little bit of an outline of what I hope to do with you today. We won't cover everything, but in complete detail at least, because this is a huge area. But I do want to introduce you to some special older adults in my life, and you might be thinking about some important older adults in your life as well. I always like to talk about the story of my interest in story. And by the way, I'll be using the word story and narrative somewhat interchangeably, because if you go to a dictionary and you look for the meaning of the word narrative, the first word you usually find is story, and vice versa. So I use them kind of in an interchangeable sort of way. I want to introduce the concept of biographical aging as distinct, shall we say, from biological aging or physiological aging. And then give you kind of an overview of narrative gerontology, which takes me into talking with you about narrative development, narrative environments, some of the narrative challenges that can face us, particularly in later life. I want to talk a little bit about narrative medicine and certainly about narrative care, and then wrap up with a really important topic of narrative self-care, which is, I think, really, really important for us to practice in the helping professions like nursing certainly is. So I like quotations. Sometimes I think that anything I've ever written is just a collection of quotations that I've tried to figure out a way to string together. But that very first one in red, every life has a story, actually it used to be the motto of the television program A&E Biography. But it's a simple statement, but it's, I think, so profoundly true. And the French novelist Gustave Flaubert says everyone's life is worth a novel, which you would expect him to say because he probably spent a lot of his time sitting in Parisian cafes looking at the world going by and seeing people and the lines on their faces and saying, ah, there's a story there. The Canadian rock star Amanda Marshall has that wonderful song, very moving. Everybody's got a story that could break your heart. And then Alex Haley, author of the book Roots, which traces the history of African Americans, said once in an interview that every time an old person dies, it's like a library burns down. And I use that quotation a lot in my classes, in my workshops, because that's so profoundly true. So you might think about the special people in your life and the library that they carry around with them in their head and heart. So as I say, I have some special older adults in my own life. There's my dad, who turned, or would have turned, 102 yesterday. Was his birthday, January the 19th. There he is standing with a cup of coffee looking out over the horizon. My family next to him, my mom and dad on their 70th anniversary, and then dad with his favorite personal support worker, Renee, and his table mate, Garth, at Windsor Court. And those are some of the books that my dad and my older sister, Carol, she's a polio survivor. She's going into her 77th year, and she's working on finishing up her autobiography, which will be called Coming Full Circle, Diaries of a Polio Survivor. She's also written a 4-volume house-to-house history of Devon, which is a region here in Fredericton. So let me start a little bit with my dad. Okay, there he is, and there I am. And So every life has a story, okay? So Dad, born in 1919. He died at the age of 98, so he had a pretty good long life. He was a United Church minister himself for 70 odd years. A very good public speaker, an adult educator. He or we as a family owned dogs and horses. He was at different times in his life while being a minister, a baseball coach, a softball coach. He was an amateur genealogist. He loved family history. He and my mother had a radio program for 20 years called Showers of Blessing. He lived in Windsor Court before he died. He couldn't walk and so forth on his own, but he still loved to have visitors. And I think of him as a good guy, complicated guy, as fathers and sons can have complex relationships, but good guy and great storyteller and joke teller. Definitely had quite a story. So if you had worked with him at Windsor Court, I hope you would have appreciated just that aspect of him. My mom, there's some pictures of her. She has a dragonfly jewelry that she likes to wear. She lives in Windsor Court too, actually. She's 99. And there she is hugging one of her favorite Sobeys checkout persons, Cindy. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the guy down below shortly. But let me go back and tell you a little bit about Mom. So she was born in 1921. Started out as a nurse, a children's nurse, actually. But married my dad and became a church, a minister's wife, which was quite a role in itself, and a church organist. And later in life, after they retired, she kept on playing the organ in local churches around the Fredericton area, and she was always on call. Anybody wanted an organist to fill in, she'd be there in a flash. So she called herself an oncologist. She's a mom, she's a great mom, and a great grandmom as well, and she's a huge Boston Red Sox fan. She has macular degeneration. She uses a walker, but she gets around pretty briskly with that walker. She loves the PSWs that attend to her needs, help her get up in the morning, get to bed at night, and she knows them by name. In fact, Mother is incredible because we tallied up here recently, she has about in excess of 100 people that she telephones on a more or less regular basis, either every day, every other day, once a week, once a month. She has a list of priorities and so forth, and she keeps in touch. So she has a very vigorous social support network, even in COVID times. I haven't seen her physically for a few weeks. Certainly won't be during the red zone, but she's a great friend to those people, and she loves hugs, and she too has quite a story. Let me just follow up with the chap at the bottom there. Some of you will recognize that's Chris Christopherson, the country music singer. I think she's fallen in love with Chris Christopherson. I'm not sure how they're going to work out the relationship because he's in Nashville or somewhere and she's in Windsor Court, so it'll be a little tough in COVID times. But she heard Chris Christopherson's song, Why Me? Or Why Me, Lord? And she broke out into tears of sweetness. And every time she can possibly listen to that song, either by Chris Christopherson himself or by George Jones, she likes the way that George Jones sings it. She loves that song. So there's a couple of people in my life. Every life has a story. So how did I get interested in story? Well, I grew up in the Maritimes, where we are right now, here, in Fredericton. And I think of the Maritimes as a particularly rich storytelling culture, where people still like to gather in the kitchen at parties and swap stories about what's going on in their lives and so forth. Big part of our culture. I learned early on, growing up in Harvey Station, New Brunswick, which is where I'm from, that you can learn a lot from older adults. As I said, my dad and my sister as well are both avid genealogists. I was a United Church minister myself, as Debbie mentioned, for about 11 years in various parts of Canada. And I listened in that role, I listened to more people's stories than I can possibly remember or recount, young and old alike. By the way, if I skip over some lines that are in black, it's because in the interest of time, I just kind of want to move along. So some more about my interest in story. I came to Stu in 1995 as a visiting chair in gerontology and began teaching courses in the study of aging to our undergraduate students majoring in gerontology, some of whom go on to be nurses. But I began to kind of react to the kind of biomedical healthcare primary way of thinking about aging, focusing on the things that go wrong with our bodies as we get older, all of which are real and serious and need to be accounted for. But there was this kind of implicit view that aging is somehow a problem to be solved rather than a part of the journey of life to be embraced. So with others, I began to envision a different way, a different approach to thinking about aging. And that led to me developing a course that I've been teaching pretty much ever since 1995 called Narrative Gerontology. And I'm going to give you a little bit of taste for that. I'm also inching my way towards retirement, and I think of retirement as the next chapter. Hopefully I'll live long enough to enjoy some of it. And the fact that my parents both lived into their 90s, or are living into their 90s in mother's case, bodes well, but I need to take care of myself, of course. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of why I'm here today sharing these ideas with you. These are some of the books that I've had an opportunity to work on over the years. The first one up on the left, The Stories We Are, kind of lays out sort of my platform, as it were. And that's a book that I wrote. It was my dissertation, actually, at university. And then the most recent one on the lower right is In Our Stories Lies Our Strength. As Debbie says, I'm quite interested these days in resiliency, spirituality, and later life, and narrative. So this concept of biographical aging. So aging is a multidisciplinary experience. We age and change over time in various ways, cognitively, socially, interpersonally, romantically, physically, biologically, physiologically, for sure. But biographical aging, to distinguish it, shall we say, from biological aging, concerns more of the inside of the aging process rather than the outside. It concerns our subjective experience of our own unique story, and how that story that we entertain of ourselves, the stories that we are, that are integral to our sense of self and identity, how that changes from when we're young to when we're middle-aged to when we're older, because that story is constantly expanding or changing. And that's why I think we have needed, and this is why I've been delighted to work in the area of what we call narrative gerontology, because our stories are in many ways who we are. Somebody says, "Oh, tell me about yourself." You don't rattle off a bunch of statistics about, your shoe size or your height and so forth. You inevitably tell a little bit of a story. Well, I was born in Newcastle, or I was born in Halifax, and came to school at UNB, and here I am pursuing a career in nursing. So I like to think that our stories are the core, or the cœur, as the French would say, of everything about us. Another thing I like to draw attention to is that, in fact, this idea of life as a story, or the metaphor of life as a story, is actually woven through our everyday speech, certainly in English at least, because we have a lot of expressions that you yourself have probably used at one point or other, like, "Yeah, that's the story of my life," or "Same old story. Oh, gee, the plot thickens." Or, "If I retire, it'll be a new chapter. Oh, he and I get along because we're on the same page. I'm going to turn over a new leaf when I go back to university. Oh, she's a real drama queen. He's a legend in his own mind." Or your friend might say to you, "Well, you can ask me anything you like because my life is an open book." So those are kind of allusions to, or references to, the storied dimensions of who we are. So a little bit about narrative gerontology. I hope I'm not going too fast. I have little sense of time. I have a clock here in front of me, but it's usually about 12 minutes slow, and I don't have a watch on. So if Debbie, if you want to call me on taking a break at a certain point, maybe another 45 minutes or so, you let me know, okay? And we can stop.
Sure, we'll do that, Bill.
Good.
If any of you listening have questions or comments and you want to put them in the chat while Bill's speaking, then one of us will be watching the chat. So thanks very much.
And if you hear some occasional banging and whatever in the background of where I'm speaking right now, it's because my neighbor is doing some construction. And about every 10 minutes, there's a truckload of fill that comes in and empties its load on the back end of his property. So a lot of beeping and banging and so forth. Anyway, so narrative gerontology, which is linked to the so-called narrative turn across the social sciences, and in fact, the medical sciences too, as you'll see shortly. A narrative approach to gerontology sees us as human beings as being inveterate or compulsive meaning makers. I've got squirrels outside my window here, along with the birds. They come to the feeders. I don't know that squirrels, or birds for that matter, spend a lot of time pondering the meaning of life or making meaning in their own lives. And they may do that. I'm not able to speak squirrel language and understand exactly what they're thinking. But certainly for us human beings, storytelling is and has been one of our main means of making meaning. There's a mouthful for you. So a narrative gerontology sees us as human beings as filled with stories. There's that idea of the library of our lives. So there's short stories about what you did last evening. There's long stories about the first marriage you had. Stories we have about the past, but we also have stories about the future and what might be and what we hope will be. We have general stories, specific stories. We have secret stories that we don't even know how to tell ourselves. And we have what I call signature stories, which are stories that we perhaps trot out and share with other people, from time to time when we want them to get to know us. So, I'm from Harvey Station, and I remember the time that, and there's that story that we've used in lots of social circumstances to give somebody else a sense of who we are. I call that some of our signature stories, and we all have, I think, quite a few of those. Probably all have stories about life in COVID times. And hopefully COVID is just one chapter in a longer story of us as human beings and in our own individual lives. A narrative gerontology also appreciates what I call the novelty of our lives. Remember that expression by Gustave Flaubert, everyone's life is worth a novel? Well, I think you could say that each of us is the author or co-author, narrator, protagonist, main character, some days we're minor characters in our own stories, editor and reader kind of all at once of the stories that we ourselves are living. So we're living stories that we ourselves are composing, always from within them. It's a kind of a weird way of thinking about human lives, but I think it's a helpful one once you play with it. These are some of the books that have come out in over the last 10, 20 years. On the topic of narrative gerontology and narrative psychology, if you want to follow up further. And by the way, I've given you in the slides my email address and my website. If you do want to follow up, I'm happy to chat with anybody about these sorts of things. So more on narrative gerontology. One of the things that I think a narrative or a storied perspective on aging helps us to do in ways that mainstream gerontology doesn't quite so easily, is to see the links and to make the links between memory, specifically autobiographical memory, meaning, and elusive but important topics like wisdom and spirituality. So a narrative gerontology has the opportunity, I think, to see older adults as truly or potentially our elders, to use that wonderful phrase, that wonderful word from our First Nations communities. And a narrative approach can look at aging as a process not just of getting old, but of actually growing old. And it appreciates what I call what has been called the philosophic homework of later life, or the story work of later life. And that's where I think you, as nurses, can play a very important role without even realizing it in helping some older person that you may be caring for undertake some of that important story work that comes with later life. I'll say more about that shortly. From a narrative perspective, I think there's an opportunity to see a link between resilience, and we're all, keen to have resilience in our own lives and to encourage resilience in other people's lives. The link between resilience and having what I call a good, strong story. We've had a project going on at St. Thomas University through our Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Narrative, otherwise known as CERN, not to be confused with that place over in Switzerland where they bang atoms together. You can hear some of the banging going on in the background, perhaps. Another truckload has just arrived. Anyway, we have a project that's been going on for close to 10 years now, where we've been looking at narrative resilience in older people's lives. And we've made a pretty important discovery, I think, which is that people who have gone through all kinds of stuff, I mean, you know, husbands dying, children passing away, bankruptcy, getting displaced because a dam is made in their neighborhood and so forth, and yet have a strong story, score really high on measures of resilience, and will say things like, you know, I got a story to tell, or I'm going to write my autobiography someday. And one woman said it's going to be a trilogy plus. Interestingly, the people in our study who scored highest were older women. Older men, not quite so high, because there are gender differences in how we story our lives. A narrative gerontology looks at the developmental tasks of later life as narrative tasks. And that concept of developmental tasks, I'm sure you're familiar with that if you've taken any courses in developmental psychology, like by Erik Erikson and so forth, where we realize that at every stage of life, whether we're little kids or teenagers or middle-aged folks or whatever, there are certain tasks that we need to master as we move through that stage. So all in all, I'm always very excited to talk about narrative gerontology, because I think it provides a different starting point for studying aging and for thinking about what aging is and can be. By the way, that picture there of the two people, I think they're both women, was a picture taken by my sister Carol, who's a hero in my life story, the polio survivor. But she's an avid photographer, and you may have seen her if you live in the Fredericton area. You may have seen her going around on her motorized scooter and stopping and aiming her camera to catch a picture like this one here. So let me talk a little bit with you about narrative development. So development, like aging, is a complex, multi-dimensional process. We develop sexually, we develop physiologically, we develop cognitively, etc. But I think you can also talk about narrative development, how we develop narratively or biographically, autobiographically. And here's a quotation from a very well-regarded person in the field of narrative psychology named Dan McAdams, who's a professor at Northwestern University in Chicago. Now, growing up, we used to say Chicago. I don't know why we put an R in there. It was Chicago, the Chicago Blackhawks. So there's no R in Chicago, I'm here to tell you. Anyway, he says identity. And identity is, of course, that concept that psychologist Erik Erikson kind of focused for us is very important. And he talks about identity crisis, the identity crisis that we can go through as adolescents, figuring out who we are as distinct from who our parents say we are and so forth. But he says, McAdams says, identity is a life story, which he defines as, and I don't want to bore you with this, but it's kind of important as a touchstone. Identity is a life story. In other words, an internalized and evolving, ever-changing narrative. Elsewhere, he says personal myth that provides a life, or our life, with a sense of unity or coherence, meaning, and purpose. So that's how important a person's story is to them. It provides them with a sense, more or less, of coherence and unity, of meaning, and of purpose. You're here today taking this course, pursuing this degree, to have this career because part of your story is, I want to be a nurse, a caring, kind, competent nurse. So that story has brought you to this place, you could say. So stories have power. And they're not static. The stories that we entertain about our lives, both the individual stories and, if you will, the larger story of our life as a whole, which I think is what Dan McAdams is talking about here, that's continually changing. It's thickening. We talk about the plot thickening. Well, you're at a thicker stage in the development of your own personal life plot today than you were a year ago or 10 years ago, and so forth. There's a sense in which, as we get older, there may be a narrowing, at least in terms of what's been called the landscape of action in our lives, but the landscape of consciousness, which is a distinction I could talk about later, can continue to thicken. I think my mother's, even though she's limited in what she can do and get around on her own and so forth, there, with all those 100+ people and all those relationships that she has, her life story is still going on. We're continually adding new episodes, new subplots, new chapters. You start a new relationship with somebody special, and that's a new subplot with a new character that's brought into your story. And by the way, when I invite students in my class to think about their own lives as an unfolding story that they're in the middle of, many of them will say to me that actually gives thinking of their life as a story, and it gives them a sort of an affectionate distance and detachment on some of the stuff that they may be going through, the hard stuff, the difficult stuff. Well, it's just part of my story. It too will pass. This is not the whole story. This chapter, this COVID chapter that we're all going through, it's not the whole story. We'll look back and say, wow, I lived through that. I'm proud. Hopefully lived through it. Anyway, so we're continually adding new chapters, new episodes, new subplots. Every day, something new happens, which adds to your story. We're continually storing and restoring our identity. I want to talk about that here in a second. Here's something that's in black, so I shouldn't need to talk about it, but I think it's important, particularly when you're talking with older adults. And that is that the real past is fixed. I mean, such and such happened 10 years ago, yesterday. You can't change that. But you can change how you remember that. So the real past is fixed, but the remembered past is fluid. And I think sometimes when you talk with and work with older adults, you can feel that reworking of the remembered past continually going on. New meanings can always be gleaned from old tales, I like to say. So there is thus no end to our narrative development. In the same way that when you read a great book or watch a great movie, it stays with you. And you continue to draw meaning and insight and inspiration perhaps from that story, from that novel, from that movie. We're narratively developing from the cradle to the grave. All of us, all the time. These are some very happy people, very positive about their narrative development. But I think once you start to realize that, yeah, I'm not just developing academically and physically and financially, etc., but I'm developing narratively as well. My story is continually changing. And I have a degree of narrative agency as to how that story does unfold. So let me tell you a little bit about my own narrative development. These are some pictures from my life. The one on the top left is my sister Carol took that at the Harvest Jazz and Blues Festival a few years back. The one to the right of that on the top is when I was a minister. And I think at the time, excuse me, I was serving a small congregation north of Toronto, Creemore, if anybody is familiar with the rural Ontario in the greater Toronto region. Creemore is where Creemore Springs beer is made or brewed, and it's not far from where Miss Vicky's potato chips were born. So that's my mother, and my sister Donna, who is just a loving, lovely person, lives with her family in Virginia. So I don't get to see them very often this time of with all that's going on. But they had come to visit me on Remembrance Day Sunday at the church in Creemore, and I think probably Mother played the organ that day. So that was about 30 years ago now, I guess. Now, the picture on the lower left, you're wondering, well, what's that? Who's that? Well, that's me, moi. And there I am across from the phone booth. You can see that phone booth. Remember those things? On the main drag of Harvey Station, New Brunswick, Canada. And I'm standing out in front of what would have been Al Knowlton's general store, probably around 7 or 8 years of age. And there I am standing, arms akimbo, and I'm trying to figure out what I was thinking, or because I don't really remember that day. All I have is the picture. Sometimes in our lives, we don't have the memories, at least very explicitly, but we have the pictures to remind us that there must be a memory there somewhere. So I've been going through some decluttering lately here in my house, getting rid of a lot of papers and so forth. The hardest part will be getting rid of pictures of my past and my family's past. This is one that I have, and I cherish it, even though, as I say, I can't remember the day itself. But you might be wondering, well, what's that look on little Billy's face? Am I annoyed because my picture is being taken by somebody and I don't want it to be taken? Am I angry because I didn't get the chocolate bar that I hope mommy or daddy was going to buy me in Al Knowlton's store? Or do I really have to pee? I'm not sure what's going on, okay? But here's the deal, Lucille. I have a letter that I saved, or that was saved for me, typewritten, that I actually typed on the typewriter that we had before the days of computer, on the occasion of my 8th birthday, December 1st, 1958. And Aura and Sheldon were family friends. They didn't have children of their own, so they showered a lot of gifts on me and my sisters. And what they had given me for my 8th birthday was a gun and holster set. I don't even know whether they sell those things, or those are things are given as toys, but that was a big deal for me. And I was pretty impressed with the fact that there were 43 plastic bullets, okay? And this was a gun and holster set that was based on the television show that we had at the time called Have Gun Will Travel. You think I was, from the U.S. and believed in the amendment or whatever. But anyway, it was a cowboy show, and I was so pleased to receive from Aura and Sheldon the gun and holster set with 43 bullets. I thank you an awful lot. My mother, up above there, was a stickler for bread and butter letters, writing letters to whomever for the hanky or the socks that they sent you for your birthday or for Christmas. Dear Aura and Sheldon. Well, I was really excited to write this letter because I was very pleased. It wasn't just a handkerchief or a pair of socks. It was a gun and holster set. I thank you an awful lot for the gun and holster set and 43 bullets. Do you know on TV that show Have Gun Will Travel? I think it is his pair, that cowboy. It's a real good gun. You can flash draw. Daddy said we could try practicing at Grammy's pictures, Grammy being his mother-in-law. That was a joke, but I wanted to include that in my letter. So I'm not sure what Orange Sheldon's reaction was when they opened up this letter, but I was pleased to have a copy of it still in my collection. So that gives you a sense, I think, of how, for me, the story I understand my life to be about is continually changing. The story that I was telling myself, such as it was at age 8, was different from age 38 or 58 and so forth. So that's, I hope, gives you some sense of how our stories about our lives, which are integral to who we are, the way we think and feel and interact, are continually changing. A couple of quotes. We are like stories that are unfolding according to our own inner theme and plot. Now that's a simple little statement, but there's a lot packed into that. The one in the middle, from a masterful book by Donald Polkinghorne called Narrative Knowing in the Human Sciences, which came out in 1988 and is a landmark text. If you ever want to go on and do some more work in narrative and nursing, which is, by the way, a whole field in itself, or narrative medicine, narrative psychology, I think you would want to start with a book like Donald Polkinghorne's, who says, we are in the middle of our stories and we can't be sure how they will end. We're constantly having to revise the plot as new events are added to our lives. Again, a lot packed up in that sentence. And lastly, bottom there, Christina Baldwin, from her wonderful book, Story Catcher, says, everyone enters life as a blank page and leaves life as a full book. Now, I have question marks there because I love that, but I don't quite agree with it. And I suspect many of you don't either. I don't think we enter life as a blank page. We enter life, in a sense, bearing the stories and the heritage and the hassles and the hang-ups sometimes of our parents and of their parents and the families before them and so forth. So no one is, narratively speaking, an island. But the idea of leaving life as a full book, again, I think we leave life with the book as full as it can be, but there are lots of chapters that we might have lived that we didn't have a chance to. So I like the phrase, I like the quotation, but it's you have to think about it a little bit. Back to Dan McAdams. I told you about him before and his idea of identity as an evolving, an internalized and evolving story. He's actually gone to the bother of trying to identify in broad terms, at least, the stages, if you like, according to which our life stories do unfold and do develop. And the stages are the pre-mythic, the mythic, and the post-mythic. Remember I mentioned that he sometimes uses the word personal myth rather than narrative. Myth, not as in something that's untrue, but the kind of the core story that we tell ourselves about who we are, where we've come from, where we're going, which of course can change. But he says there's three broad stages: the pre-mythic, which is in infancy and childhood, where he says we're kind of unwittingly gathering material that could later become central to our understanding of what our story is. We're, as one writer says, we're budding novelists, like even little Billy there, at age 8. I was gathering material for what would eventually, become the story that I began telling myself as to who I was, when I got into my teen years. One of those stories is my iron lung story. And if there's time, I'd like to share that with you, but I'm not going to burden it with you right now. Perhaps later on in the session, I can tell you my iron lung story, because it's kind of funny, but it's one of my signature stories. So as we move into adolescence, says Dan McAdams, we move into what he calls the mythic stage. We're beginning in earnest to figure out what the story of our life is for us. Not somebody else's story about us, not our parents or our chums or our teachers, but what's my story? And this can be a very tumultuous time in families when you've got teenagers who not only have hormones raging, but they're narratively they're more active, shall we say, or they're taking on more narrative agency of who they are. We're beginning the story, says McAdams. There's the emergence of an autobiographical consciousness, a consciousness of me, as distinct from who you think I am or who you tell me I am. Now, in early adulthood and middle adulthood, we're continually, says McAdams, expanding that story, adding more characters. You get married and unmarried, you have kids, you have blended families, you have this job, then you get this degree, and then you get that job. Things are always changing, expanding, as I say, more characters, subplots, and themes. Although many of the themes in our stories are, you could say, if this is a Freudian perspective, are kind of woven in sort of early on and maybe never entirely leave us. But I think we're always adding some new themes, thickening the plot. And maybe in middle adulthood, I mean, there's no precise years that are involved here. There's in some sense in which we begin to revise the plot. We have this notion of the midlife crisis, which I think is a misnomer. People who research this says there really isn't anything to that idea. But it could be argued that in midlife, we begin to shift around. The kids are growing up, maybe they've left home, you're starting a career or a degree that you sort of put on hold from before. There is that revising of the plot. There's that rewriting of the self, to use a phrase from my friend Mark Freeman, a narrative psychologist. So then in late adulthood, and McAdams doesn't specify when that could begin. Some people move into late adulthood when they're only in their 40s. They seem to age psychologically and philosophically and spiritually early on. But the post-mythic stage, when we begin, we're more sort of looking back than we are looking ahead. We're becoming involved in reviewing the story that we've been. I'll say a bit more about that shortly. On some level, maybe the plot is thinning, children leaving home, maybe you retire, your income reduces, your mobility is compromised, so you aren't able to get out and about quite so much. So your narrative environment, which I'll say more about shortly, is narrowing in to some degree. But it's the stage when thinking about and understanding what our story is and has been, or could be still, becomes really, really important. And my friend Mark Freeman refers to later life as potentially the narrative phase par excellence. Okay, so when you're 2 years of age, or 1 or 2, I don't know, it varies, I'm sure, from one individual to another, there are certain developmental tasks that that we need to master. You know, you need to be able to go to the bathroom on your own, to talk, to use language, to walk. And when you're in your teens, the developmental tasks are different, but they're quite clear and obvious. Well, there are developmental tasks all the way through life, even in later life, even in very late life. Okay, and I call them. You can see that I'm using the letter R to begin all of my. You may have heard of the expression reading, writing, and arithmetic, which is what many of us of my age, at least, were. That was what school revolved around: reading, writing, and arithmetic. So the 3 R's. Well, maybe there's 10, 11, 12, 13 R's. I've written in one place recently. I call them the 13 R's of later life. So what are they? Hope I'm not going too fast, folks. And how are we doing time-wise, Debbie?
So it's about 9:44 or so, Bill. So I don't know if you've got a spot to stop in the next 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, that sounds good to me. Yep. And I'll refresh my coffee, and other people can do other things for 10 minutes or so. Yeah. Okay. I'll go for a little bit longer then. How'd that be? I'll get through this. How about I get through this slide here? So one of the developmental tasks of later life is review, or life review. I'm referring here to Erik Erikson's very well-known 8 stages of psychosocial development. You probably have studied them in high school or some other courses. There's identity versus role diffusion. There's intimacy versus isolation. And then, and he was kind of vague about this, as we move into mid and later life, generativity versus stagnation, which is stage 7. And then stage 8 is ego integrity versus despair. And that's kind of the crisis, he says, that we are wrestling with on some deep psychological, emotional level, whether we ever articulate that to ourselves. But integral to achieving what he calls ego integrity is a process of life review, which he believed, and others like him, believed that we engage in kind of automatically, spontaneously. There's this tendency to kind of look back over your life and hopefully come to some evaluation that's basically positive. Well, all things considered, I did the best I could with the opportunities I had and the limitations I had dealt with and so forth. So a lot of the older people that you may be working with in your role as nurses or nurses in training are in some way, Erikson would suggest, the McAdams, involved in that reviewing process, and you may become part of that. Come along with that is reflecting, thinking back, making sense of things. There's that philosophic homework that I alluded to earlier on. Okay, remembering, which is it's the word remember, but with a hyphen, this deliberately put between the re and the member, because it's a process, a task of pulling ourselves together. You may have had friends say to pull yourself together. Come on, get going. Well, there is a sense in which later life, one of the tasks is to pull ourselves together. A wonderful quotation from Florida Scott Maxwell, a person whose book, The Measure of My Days, is a treasure. She wrote it in her 80s. It was kind of her journal while she was living in a special care home in England. And she said, how does that expression go? I've got to read that to you. 1 minute, please. I didn't have it up on the screen, but I will share it with you. This is from a book, Reading Our Lives, that Debbie might have mentioned earlier on. Anyway, they have a little quotation here, which is, when you truly possess or own all you have been and done, which may take some time, says Florida Scott Maxwell, you are fierce with reality. Ooh, I love that. But possessing, pulling together all that you've been and done, your thoughts and so forth. That's a developmental task, I think it could be argued, of later life. It's not necessarily one that you think of or are aware of explicitly, but it's there on some subliminal level. Reconciling ourselves in later life to the difficulties that we've had, the troubles, the traumas that we've gone through, and so forth. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Maybe one of the tasks is to resolve as best we can, to deal with resentments that we've harbored in our hearts for years, or regrets, or unfinished business, to repair, to mend fences. You'll sometimes have a sense with older people who know that their time is not, unlimited, that it's time for them to go and visit that friend that they had a rift of some sort with years ago, and to try to patch things up and make amends and make some sort of peace. Okay, to revise. Um, there's a quotation that circulates apparently among the world of psychiatrists. It's never too late to have a happy childhood. um, so again, that sifting through and that reworking of what your life has been is something that can be going on in your mind and heart on some sort of level just below the surface. A lot of people, in their 80s and 90s have gone through some pretty challenging childhood times, perhaps growing up in the Depression, etc., like my parents did. Times are tough, but if you can look back and say, you know what, my parents didn't have very much, but there was a lot of love around the kitchen table. They gave us what they could. There was always food on the table for us, and every year we got a new pair of shoes or whatever. So looking back and making sense in a positive way. This leads to what gerontologists refer to as the positivity bias that many older adults exude, which is a tendency to look back over the past and to accentuate the positive and to play down the negative, and to focus on the positive memories and have the positive emotions associated with them, and not dwell on the negative. Not in all cases. We have some older people that become cranky and angry, and that's where some narrative care can come in. Resigning ourselves to our life is what it had to be. It is what it had to be. I did what I could. I wasn't perfect, and I didn't make best use of the advantages I might have had, but given the circumstances, I did the best I could. My life is what it had to be. Then there's that, what I call the recycling, which is hopefully having an opportunity to pass on your stories, and with your stories, your wisdom to other people, which is part of, I think, the autobiographical urge that some gerontologists have noted among older adults, which is to share their stories for the sake of their children. I've worked with people in life writing groups, older adults in life writing groups, and that desire to get their story down and to give it to their kids and their grandkids as a Christmas present, as a book, a memoir, so that their kids and their grandkids will know, oh yeah, that's what mom went through. That was dad's life. Oh, okay, it's passing on. That's part of generativity as well, passing on your narrative legacy to the next generations. Maybe some degree of rehearsing and preparing for the end of our life story, knowing that our story, or at least this chapter of our story, will come to an end, and maybe preparing for what's beyond. I can talk about that later. Overall, the developmental tasks of later life could be summed up with the word reading our lives. And I could say more about that, but I think I'll maybe stop there, Debbie, for a while, okay? Because the next slide is a kind of a different topic of narrative environments.
All right, that's great. Thank you, Bill. Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything you'd like to share? Maybe about an older adult in your family, in your life, whose story you might want to share? Guess the coffee maybe hasn't quite kicked in yet. We need another cup. So how about we come back at 5 after 10, and then we'll carry on hearing the stories. Okay, so 10:05. We'll see everyone back. Thanks.
Hello, are we back?
I think they gave us one more minute, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now what happened to my screen?
Coffee's almost ready.
Do you see me when I am talking?
Yep, we do. We see you at the bottom of the screen, and then we see your slideshow on the main
okay.
screen.
Okay, good, thanks. Is that you, Andrea?
No, that was one of the students.
Oh, okay.
Camera.
All I see are letters, A, T, B, B, S, whatever.
I was wondering if you wanted someone to turn on their camera because it is hard to talk to a blank screen, or not a blank screen. It's hard to talk to your screen.
Yeah, that would be great. That'd be great. Sure.
I'm not sure that everybody, I think you probably, I don't mind having my camera on. But.
The only thing is that if we have too many cameras on, it obscures some of the stuff on the screen, and that does it? Yeah.
Not when you're watching, I don't think.
No.
Yeah, but maybe a few of the people in the class, the students, could put their cameras on, just here and there as well. And yeah, I think we're ready to go again, Bill, if that's good with you.
Okay, sure. All right. Great. Well, just one final thing to say about what I'm referring to as the developmental tasks of later life, these various R's, is that last one, read, is maybe kind of sums it up, because in the book that Elizabeth McKim and I wrote some years ago called Reading Our Lives, The Poetics of Growing Old, we do kind of pull all those other R's together into in other words, you know, it's one thing to tell our stories as we get older, but maybe it's also important for us to step back from and to read or to reflect on our stories as well. And there's an opportunity for growth there that I'll say more about when I talk about narrative challenges. So now let's shift gears, folks, and talk about what I call narrative environments. And maybe the key point to be made here is that you don't store your life in a vacuum. You store your life within a larger story, for example, of your family. I mean, there's my family there on the lower part of the slide. I can't tell my story about me without telling you something about my mom and her story, or my dad and his story, and my sisters, Carol and Donna, and so forth. So we are part of the Randall family story, which is like a larger story that shapes, for better for worse, many things about each of us as members of that family. But a relationship, a marriage, a friendship can also, of course, contribute to the storying of our lives and the restoring of our lives in profound ways. The organizations that we're part of, the associations that we're members of, the communities that we live in, the religions or the political ideologies that we adhere to. These, you could argue, are larger stories that embrace our individual stories and can profoundly shape how those stories unfold. So within each of these larger stories, now maybe we'll focus for the sake of convenience on the family story, because we all have some sort of a family story that we know we're part of, we feel close to, or identify with in some way. Within the larger story of the Randall family, my story, my unfolding, evolving personal narrative has been edited, nudged in this way, and in that way, in unique directions, which it wouldn't have been if I'd been brought up in a different family narrative environment. I think here of my good friend who recently passed away, Allie Wood, from Harvey Station. He was a school chum of mine, and there were times when I would get to go with him on the school bus from school out to his family farm outside of the metropolis of Harvey Station and spend the night. And growing up in the manse, my father was a minister, therefore we lived in the manse. It was a very special kind of narrative environment because my dad was kind of the old school dad, and there were certain children were to be seen and not heard in some respects. And he had more airtime in our family gatherings at the meal table and so forth. And there were just certain things you could talk about and you couldn't talk about. Anyway, when I went out to spend the night with my buddy Allie Wood and his family, I could recall the feeling I would have around the dinner table, around the Wood family dinner table. I felt like I was the main attraction. You know, I was the minister's kid, so maybe they were on their best behavior. But I felt like I could sort of say whatever I wanted to, or tell my dumb jokes and so forth, and people would think I was just absolutely hilarious and such a great kid. Then when I had to go back to the Randall family dinner table the next night, it was back to that same kind of narrative environment, which you can almost feel. Okay, so there's the Simpson family. There, I found that on the internet. They have their unique ways of interacting with each other. So a narrative environment, particularly when you think of the family, it's a very powerful concept. And you know, a classroom is a narrative environment. An institution, St. Thomas, UNB, overall perhaps different narrative environments from one faculty to another, etc. So the concept of narrative environment is really one you can work with quite a bit. And to put it very crudely or bluntly, you know, you could say that narrative environments can be positive or negative in nature. They can be supportive or they can be suppressive, and everything in between, obviously. They can be rich or rigid, growth inviting or growth inhibiting, open or closed, stimulating or stultifying. I had fun playing with these sorts of alliterations. Restorying or de-storying, if you like that word. I like to make up words. Sometimes making up words helps you to express concepts a bit better. So de-storying is a play on the words of destroy. You know, sometimes we can de-story people. I'll say more about that shortly. So when you think about, for example, a hospital or a nursing home, and some of you are going to have experience, I understand, in nursing homes and other long-term care facilities. They can be very nurturing, some are, or they can be not so nurturing, numbing, if you will. And that's often a whole bunch of reasons why that might be the case. They can help or they can hinder us regarding what I call the narrative challenges of aging. So I've talked about the narrative tasks. I'd like to talk about the challenges of aging. So these are some of the challenges I think you can identify. And when you're working with older patients, you might, you know, have your antenna up as well. What are there certain narrative challenges that this individual is dealing with, whether they can talk about it or not? The first one on the list here is narrative loneliness. And this is a term that a colleague of mine, Clive Baldwin, at St. Thomas University, now the director of CERN and Canada Research Chair in Narrative Studies. Brilliant man. Narrative loneliness is, you know, what you experience. It's loneliness, okay, but it has a narrative dimension because there's, as we get older, the potential for there being fewer and fewer people left who know our story. You know, when you get to be my age and older, you spend a lot of time going to funerals. And it's not necessarily a fun thing, but it's not necessarily a sad, depressing thing entirely either. But there's a sense in which with each funeral, you're losing a friend who has some version of your story, has some knowledge of who you are. And as you lose more and more such people, then there are fewer around you to support the story by which you've understood who you are. maybe that's not a bad thing. But narrative loneliness, I think, is particularly important to keep in mind as an issue in COVID times. And we're well aware of the statistics of older adults in institutions of one sort or another who can't see their families, and their families can't see them, and it's just terrible. But it's the way that things have to be, understandably. And my mom, however, she's got the telephone, okay? So every morning and every evening, at least twice, sometimes 2 or 3 times in between, we have a little conversation. And I know that I'm not the only one she's talking with, so I don't feel that special. I know she's got another potentially 100 people that she's going to have some sort of interaction with through the telephone. Thank God for Alexander Graham Bell and the telephone, or cell phone, or whatever it is. Well, she doesn't have a cell phone. So narrative loss is associated with narrative loneliness. And I think of narrative loss as when, for example, you have to relocate from the big house up on the hill where you live with and raised your family to the smaller apartment in town, you know, closer to amenities and doctors and so forth. And then from there to the retirement home, and then maybe to the nursing home. Each move, you're having to get rid of stuff. Okay, there are people in our city who are involved in the decluttering industry. They're life transition experts, and they help people to make decisions as well. I can't take this with me because I only have so much space in the place I'm moving to. So what are the objects or the items that I really need to have with me, and others that I can not have? I've spent the last week exhausting myself decluttering. In fact, before this class started this morning, I took out to the side of the road not 1, not 2, but 12 garbage bags filled with papers that I've been cleaning out of my home office here at home. And it was excruciating to figure out, well, I can't throw that away. I gotta throw that away. I have extra copies, so I can throw that away, okay? But I had to kind of wrestle with each piece of paper almost, whether to keep it or to cull it. But you can imagine if you're moving to a nursing home and all you really have that you can take with you is a couple of boxes full of some mementos and so forth. Those things, literally things, represent parts of our lives or parts of our story. And when we have to downsize, there is that loss of not just the things themselves, but of the parts of our story that they represent or remind us of. And there's also a possibility of a loss of what could be called narrative agency. When everybody else around you is doing stuff to you and for you, it can be difficult to accept that, you know, I don't have as much agency in the circumstances of my life as I would like to have. Narrative dispossession is a term, again, coined by my colleague and friend Clive Baldwin at St. Thomas, which I think is a very powerful term. When we, and this can be often the case when we're interacting with people who have dementia, when the person who has dementia has less and less ability to tell us who they are, to tell stories about themselves and their lives, because they're drifting into the world of dementia and losing their capacity to use language in a coherent kind of way, or at least coherent to us. There is the temptation for us to dispossess such individuals of their stories, in the sense that, you know, if person X can't share with us who they are, then, and if we're just introduced into their life, you know, when the dementia is sort of well in progress, it's tempting on some level to just sort of assume that the person is not there anymore. And I think that it's really important to remember that there's always a story, even if the person is not able to share, you know, facts and information and stories about their lives. There's still a story there. Still people can still be biographically active, even if not in a way that readily makes sense to us. And there's a whole body of literature, I'm happy to report, on narrative and dementia. One of the words I like to use is stereotyping, which is a play on the word stereotyping. And I think when we classify people whom we don't really know but we judge them because of what they're wearing or the color of their skin or the jewelry that they have or whatever. And we slap a story onto them that's you know, let me give you an example. When back in the day when we used to be able to fly in airplanes, remember those things? You might have occasion to sit in an airport, okay? And if you're sitting in an airport waiting for your flight to take off, there is the tendency to just kind of people watch. That's not a problem. That's a natural enough thing to do. But when you people watch and you see this person going by and then they go by again, and you start formulating a story in your mind about what that person is like, what political beliefs they have, perhaps, what they had for breakfast, where they go to church or what religion they had, etc. And before you know it, you got a pretty good storyline going because our imagination needs to naturally kind of create stories to make sense of circumstances and of the people in our lives. So you get this storyline going about this person who's going back and forth, and suddenly you realize, oh, I'm sitting next to this person on the plane. And you start to have a conversation with them, and you find out, much to your annoyance, that they're not at all like you had sort of constructed them in your imagination, that the way you'd stereotype them in your mind. I use the words dear and sweetie here on this line because I think this can be an issue when we're working with older adults. To use terms that could be misinterpreted by the older person themselves, understandably, as paternalizing or paternalistic, etc., or infantilizing. But the irony here is that my mother, age 99, she actually likes to be referred to as dear or sweetie by the staff who are much younger than she is. So it can be kind of an individual sort of thing. But I think the general rule is not to start with dear or sweetie. But if you find that like someone like my mom who loves to be hugged and loves to have that kind of personal, affectionate interchange, that dear and sweetie might work just fine for someone like her. Narrative atrophy is a term that I like to use, and I'm referring to a statistic that I'm not confident about at all, but I read somewhere once, okay, or heard somewhere once that studies have shown that in average nursing home, probably not in Canada, certainly not in New Brunswick or the Maritimes, but maybe, calculations have indicated that the average resident, older adult resident, might have no more than 6 minutes per day of a real meaningful contact with another human being. And those 6 minutes are perhaps going to be taken up primarily with the tasks that need to be done, getting someone to their meal, helping them to get dressed and undressed, etc., and so forth. If there's any truth to that, and that could be fake news as far as I know, but I like to put that in. If you were in an institution as an older adult and you didn't get any more than 6 minutes per day of contact, and most of that contact was task oriented, it would be narrative loneliness, narrative loss, narrative dispossession, all wrapped up in one, and your story would shrivel up inside of you, you could argue, on some level. Let me give you an example. No, I'm gonna hold off on that. There's a little story I want to tell, but I want to tell it a little bit further on when I think you'll really catch the point. Narrative knots, narrative contamination, narrative domination. I'm going to jump over those and get to narrative foreclosure, which is a term coined by my friend and colleague in Worcester, Massachusetts, College of the Holy Cross, Mark Freeman, a leading figure in narrative psychology. He writes about how it's possible to reach a point where your life itself is not over, but in your heart and mind, your story might as well be. Now, I go to Tim Hortons a lot. I do a lot of my homework in Tim Hortons. I just love well, I won't say I love the coffee, but I'm comfortable with the coffee. It doesn't overwhelm me like some coffees can be too strong. Coffee I'm drinking here today is awful. It's my own coffee and I hate it, but it's coffee. But I go to Tim Hortons and in fact, I wrote an entire book there once, and I would notice a pattern Maybe you've noticed this too if you hang out at Tim Hortons or other such coffee shops. Around about 10 o'clock in the morning, a bunch of guys will shuffle in, retirees typically. And they sit kind of in one corner. There's a whole bunch of them, all kind of piled together like starlings on a telephone line or whatever. And they're swapping stories and comparing notes about whatever, the hockey game, the half-ton truck that somebody just bought, hunting and so forth. And then around 11:30, they kind of drift away. And then 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the same folks come back again. There are groups of women as well, but I'm particularly aware of the men because I have a sense that we men are more susceptible to narrative foreclosure than women are. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The studies have also shown that there are gender differences in how women and men story their lives. I could go into that, and it starts in childhood, where little girls, for example, so Robin Fivish of Emory University has determined with her colleagues, little girls are more likely to be coached, often by their mothers, to tell fairly nuanced and elaborate and detailed stories about going to the zoo or whatever experience is going on in their 3 or 4 year old lives. Whereas little boys are more likely to be coached, often say by their dads, to stick to the facts. Don't go on and on and on and on and on and on. Now, insofar as there's some veracity to that pattern, and if that pattern continues across the lifespan, you could argue that women reach later life with perhaps richer, thicker, more nuanced, more detailed stories about different parts of their lives. And men, if they have been over-identified with their career, once that career is over because of retirement, a big chunk of their narrative identity sort of goes off, and it leaves them high and dry on some level. So I don't want to say too much about this, but I think narrative foreclosure is a thing. You can be 15 years of age, of course, and experience narrative foreclosure. You can have a girlfriend or a boyfriend that says, bye-bye, sayonara, and you think, what's the point of going on? Why must the world go on turning? Da, da, da. Some of you know that song. I think you do, Debbie. Anyway, and so you think, well, there's no point in going, and unless your mom or your dad or your friends say, look, you're a lot better without him or her, There's lots more fish in the sea. So your story opens back up again. So narrative foreclosure, though, I think is something that we can be particularly susceptible to in later life. I'll say more about that, I think, later. Narrative narrowing is when our narrative environments narrow in because we're in an institution, for example, and we don't have the things and the people around us to kind of support and keep alive that rich, thick story about who we are. That's a challenge. And then lastly on this list, what could be called narrative imprisonment. When you're imprisoned within a grudge that you can't let go of towards somebody or something that happened, or you're imprisoned in a role that is no longer quite applicable, but you're still stuck with that in your mind, or a certain storyline about who you are and what the world is, etc. Or you're imprisoned in regret. These are realities at any point in life, but perhaps particularly for older people in some cases. And this is a little cartoon I came across somewhere that I think kind of illustrates what I call narrative imprisonment. Here's a guy, he happens to be a guy, holding on to, something that's a prison for him. And at the same time, he's trying to let go of it. So what do you want to say to a guy like this? Drop it, let it go. Easier said than done, because stories have staying power in our lives. And the story that we entertain about who we are, where we've come from, where we're going, may or may not be a healthy story. This is where narrative therapy comes in. I'll say a little bit about that later on, where you help someone to actually re-story. All therapy, it could be argued, is a form of helping people to re-story to more life-affirming, positive stories that have more narrative openness built into them. So
Bill.
still a bit more on narrative challenges.
Bill,
Yes.
Tamara made a comment in the chat that she said, I find that imprisonment and trauma are often tied together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm not an expert in the field of trauma by any means, but exactly. Your life is sadly dominated by a story that's all too true and traumatic, and not easy to walk away from or let go of or see in perspective, as it's so powerful. So thanks for drawing attention to that. And again, when you're dealing with older people, you never know what traumas people are still carrying in their hearts, or have never been able to kind of get off their minds or hearts by being able to talk about them with a compassionate listener. And compassionate listening is the core of narrative care, which I'm going to be saying more about shortly. So just more on the idea of narrative challenges, I think that going into a hospital as a patient or a nursing home as a resident is itself a restoring experience. And it forces us to revise the plot, whether a little or a lot. If it's just going in for a hernia operation, no big deal, NBD as they say. It's not the whole story of your life, just one little chapter that maybe you'll chuckle about at some point. Not something you look forward to, but it's not going to define you. Okay, that being in the hospital for that procedure, etc., because you're going to be out in a few days and back to normal, more or less. But if you're in a hospital day after day, after week, after week, after month, then the restoring dimension to that experience can be extremely powerful. And it can be, at worst, a de-storing experience, where there's an excellent writer whom we've had at St. Thomas to give a talk called Art Frank. He has a marvelous book, a number of books, but perhaps he's best known for his book, The Wounded Storyteller, which is an account of his own time in hospital with cancer, which he survived, and has gone on to write about in a number of wonderful publications. But in the book, The Wounded Storyteller, he talks about how for patients like himself, there are like three broad sort of, I'm drifting a bit here, but I think it might be helpful. There's three broad ways in which we can story our illness experience. One is what he calls the restitution narrative, where, hey, I got to have a gallbladder removed, no big deal, I'll be back to normal, or I've got cancer, but the doctors are onto this, and the tests are going to come back negative, and I'm going to beat this, okay? And life will be back to normal, more or less. The chaos narrative is where your capacity to make sense of what's going on is blown out of the water. You're in a kind of state of chaos, and you don't know. You're defined by I've got cancer, and that's it. The quest narrative, which is the third, there's restitution narrative, chaos narrative, and quest narrative, is where your experience as a patient of your illness or of your time in the hospital is has a more philosophical dimension to it, where, okay, there's something to be learned from this. I'm going to grow through this. It's not ideal. I may die, but it's part of life, and there's something to be discovered. And so there's a quest dimension. I'm writing these days about aging as adventure, and this is something I'm drawing upon Art Frank's work. But if you are a patient and you overhear some people at the nursing station or wherever referring to, the gallbladder in 13B, and you realize, hey, I'm the gallbladder. I have been referred to as a gallbladder who happens to be in a certain bed, not as me, as with my unique story. So I like to reframe some of these narrative challenges that I've just listed in more medical terms. So if you'll bear with me, and please, my tongue is in my cheek, and I hope that you can get a little bit of a chuckle. So Narrative arrest, like cardiac arrest, would be when the tests come back positive and the doctor says, sorry to tell you, Bill, but you've got cancer and we don't know for sure, but maybe 6 months. It's an acute case of narrative foreclosure. My life is going to go on for 6 months, but geez, the story, it's kind of wound down, and it's all over, but they're crying. Maybe I'm not expressing myself very well, but you may be dealing with patients in a hospital situation who are in an acute state of narrative arrest, along with whatever other medical problems they're experiencing. Narrative anemia is when the story is kind of thin or weak. It doesn't have that strength, thickness to it that I think is associated with resilience. I think there are ways that we can help thicken up people's stories by the way we listen, and we'll get into that shortly. Narrative atrophy, I've already touched upon that. Narrative constipation, sorry if there's a little bit of a theme developing here, but sorry. Narrative constipation would be there's a story there, but the person can't get it out. Or an untold story. It could be a story about trauma, okay? Or a story about any number of things that the person doesn't have the opportunity or the listener or the occasion or the environment to get it out. Narrative compaction would be a more dire form of that, when you got to really dig to get the story out. People who work in the field of counseling or therapy often need to assist their clients to dig deep and to get that story out, where you can look at it and say, well, is that the story you want to live by? No. Okay, well, let's work on developing a new story. Narrative diarrhea would be, sorry if this seems inappropriate, but the story is flowing, but there's little substance to it. We all have met people in our lives who can talk, and you're looking at your clock thinking, when are they going to stop or get to the point, whatever the point might be. Narrative pregnancy, this is a weird notion, but would be when there is a new story that's brewing inside that person's mind or heart and just ready to be born, and all that's needed is the right listener to come along at the right time and help with the delivery. So those are playful sort of ways of rewording the narrative challenges that can come with later life. And I'm not suggesting that you say to the doctor, hey, I think Mrs. Smith in room 12A, and on top of whatever else they're dealing with medically, they're also they have a extreme case of narrative constipation, because you might get some weird looks. But you can have these things, I think, in your mind nonetheless. This is from a book called Listening to Life Stories, a new approach to stress intervention in healthcare. These are not doctors or nurses that have written this book, but they did a lot of research on what goes on in hospitals, healthcare settings, in terms of people's stories. And they write here, it's no great secret why we don't listen to patient stories. We're busy. We have information to gather, diagnoses to make, treatment plans to develop, medications to administer, therapy to conduct, and reports to write. But equally, they write, we want more than our professional encounter with the patient. We want to connect with patients in a way that feels meaningful to us and to them. And I think that's a helpful segue there to talk a little bit more directly about a really welcome development within the field of medicine itself called narrative medicine. And the need for narrative medicine gets brought home to me when I go to doctors' offices, as we have to do from time to time, and you see signs like this on the wall. It is now the policy of this office that we will address no more than 2 medical concerns per patient per visit. I don't know about you, but the older I get, and I have aches and pains and so forth, they seem like they're all intertwined with one another. And I can't just sort of, I can't just talk about 2, I've got to talk about 22, because I think they're all might be relevant. But the doctor, the nurse, they have only got so much time. There's 100 other people waiting to see them on that given day. So I understand the policy, but it does kind of set the tone for the narrative environment for what we can talk about, when we visit our healthcare people who are busy, as the other book says. But here's Dr. Rita Sharon from Quebec originally. She is a medical doctor, but she also has a PhD in literature. And she's written a groundbreaking book called Narrative Medicine, honoring the stories of illness. So she and Arthur Frank, and they know each other and they kind of support each other's work, are coming at things in a similar kind of way. She defines narrative medicine and narrative medicine, narrative nursing. I mean, these terms could be used interchangeably. Narrative medicine understands that patients and caregivers enter whole with their bodies, lives, families, beliefs, values, histories, hopes for the future, enter whole into sickness and healing, and their efforts to get better or to help others get better cannot be fragmented away from the deepest parts of their lives. Oh, I made a mistake. That should be away, one word, not away. Apologize for that. So Rita Sharon established this, I'm not sure the exact title, Center for Narrative Medicine, Program for Narrative Medicine in the medical faculty at Columbia University in New York. And we have, I believe, through Dalhousie University, the component of the training which docs receive these days, maybe not called narrative medicine, but medical humanities. So it's really encouraging, and getting to talk with you folks today about this is encouraging as well, that we're realizing that we've got to honor the stories that are at work in the lives of the people whom we're hoping to heal. Some more from Rita Sharon's book, Patient-Centered Care, and that's a term that we frequently hear, I think, in healthcare settings. Respects patients' preferences, attends to patients' need for information and education, involves family and friends, assures continuity and coordination of care, and addresses the emotional aspects of illness, and seeks an integrated understanding of the patient's world. I call it their story world, their whole person, emotional needs, and life issues. That's a tall order. And in many healthcare settings, particularly those ravaged by COVID, time is of the essence. Resources are stretched to the limit. But this is a philosophy that I think needs to be, that rightly is becoming more at the center of the training of people in the healthcare field. I got a phone that's buzzing. I've got my phone on vibrate thing there, and I'm always tempted, but don't worry, I'm not going to check it out. But here's my sort of take on narrative medicine. If our patients or your patients sense that you're not interested in who they are, but only in what's wrong with them from a medical perspective, they can become impatient. There's another little play on words for you, by which, I'm non-compliant in some way, or withdrawn, crotchety, cranky. Patients understand who they are, not in terms of statistics regarding their blood pressure, their white blood count, their bone mass density, their glomerular filtration rate, etc., but in terms of their stories. Now, when you go to a hospital, I mean, hospitals are not about fixing stories. They're about fixing bodies, and that's fully understandable. But our stories are embodied, and our bodies tell stories. I think that's the point that I would want to stress here. And ultimately, we understand who we are in terms of the stories of our lives, not in terms of the stats about our lives. We understand who we are in terms of biography and not biology. And here's medical doctor Oliver Sacks, well known for a number of great books. Biologically, physiologically, he says we're not so different from each other. But historically, as narratives, we are each of us unique, or as I would say, novel. That phrase, patient's world, I think of that as their unique story world. When you enter, you maybe had people say to you, oh, you live in your own little world. Well, we all live in our own little world, our own unique story world. And when you get to know somebody, it's getting a feel for that story world, the stories that they tell about their lives, but the stories that their bodies tell, the air, the atmosphere that they exude, that's the aura around them, and their story world is central to their sense of identity, their emotional life, their values, their beliefs, and therefore I think you could argue both their physical and certainly mental health. So caring for patient stories is, you could argue, as important as caring for their bodies, because we can sense their stories in their postures, in their gestures, in their expressions, because our stories, as I say, are embodied. The lines on our faces as we get older, those lines on some level tell stories about perhaps the stress that a person has lived, or the joy that they've greeted the challenges of life with, etc. And when you take time to look at a person's face and get a feel for the stories that those lines on their faces and looks in their eyes might suggest, that's a big part of entering their unique story world. So, question is, how can hospitals, how can nursing homes continue to try to be more re-storying than de-storying? And how can we help patients or residents meet the narrative challenges and not only the physical challenges that they face? And my answer to that is by some form of narrative care. I'm not sure if we're at a breaking point here, because I don't trust my clock.
So it's 10:45. If this is a good place to break.
No, I could go on for another 10 minutes if that would work. Okay.
Sounds good.
No, what I mean is, have we roughly gone for the same amount of time as we did for the first hour, or?
No, if you go another 10, then it'd be good.
Do you mind if I break into my Tim Hortons brand muffin? Might be a little bit of noise here for a second. So narrative care. Here's some quotations that kind of pull at the heartstrings, I think. Maya Angelou, African-American poet and writer. There's no agony like bearing an untold story inside of you. And I have this picture of this woman. I don't know who this person is. I just downloaded the picture, but you can sense that maybe there is an untold story there, a story of loss or sadness or misunderstanding or trauma or whatever. It's being sensitive to what might the story be. That's exercising what I call narrative imagination in our practice. Arthur Kleiman, medical doctor, like Rita Sharon, pioneer of narrative medicine. Few of the tragedies at life's end are as rending to the clinician, doctor, nurse, as that of the frail patient who has no one left to tell their story to. Narrative dispossession, narrative loss, narrative loneliness. And then on the brighter side, you can't tell who you are unless someone is listening. So this gets us to what I think of as the core of narrative care. But here is what narrative care with older adults is not. I don't know if you can see the details in this family photo, but there's grandmother hoping to have some conversation with somebody, but everybody else is kind of looking at their devices, checking their Facebook page, texting somebody else who's not in the room, etc. But let me tell you a story about what I think narrative care is at heart. I don't have a slide for this, so bear with me. I want to tell you a little story. Maybe we can conclude with that and have our next coffee break. So my dad and my mom, in their mid-80s, had been living in a senior-friendly apartment building, which had, bars on the wall so they could get up from the bathroom or the toilet, better and so forth. But that was about all they had. They had great neighbors in the building, but Dad knew certainly that they needed to plan ahead. So he said, Bill, Ken McGeorge, the CEO over at York Care Center? He was at the time. I said, yep, sure. Well, can you arrange a tour for Mother and me? Yeah, because he said, we just want to check out, because that may be the next sort of place that we need to move to. And I want to know what we'd be looking at. So at that point, York Care Center, and some of you I think will be going there to work, had just gone through a major redevelopment, refurbishment, and so forth. Really, wonderful new additions and changes and so forth. So that's where Ken took me. I was in the rear. Dad was in the lead, walking with his cane. Mother close behind him. She was kind of skeptical about the idea of having to move or even thinking about moving to a nursing home, but she was going along with Dad's desire to get more information. So Ken was saying, "Oh, so here, over here we've refurbished things, and this is a little social area for people to have coffee, and over here and so forth." But as we were going along, this is what. Let me see if I can find this. See this picture on the lower left? This is what Dad and Mom saw, and I and Ken. I've used the phrase little old lady. Sorry if that seems the wrong term to use, but she was sitting there in her wheelchair, facing the wall. Okay, probably had wandered there from where, I'm not sure. Maybe, the person who was giving us the tour might have wished that she wasn't there because it wasn't quite what he wanted to show. But the Dad, who had been a minister for many years, noticed the woman, noticed the name tag on the back of her wheelchair. And I'm going to say that the person's name was Viola Culloden. Okay, just not exactly sure, but so Dad leans around. He has to kind of position himself carefully because he too has a cane, and he kind of looks the woman in the eye, and he says, "I see by your name tag that you're Mrs. Culloden." "Yes, I am." "You wouldn't be from up around Stanley or Williamsburg or whatever," because he knew all of the rural areas. "Well, yes, I am." And for a few minutes, just a few minutes, they had a little conversation, because Dad loved family history and was aware that, she probably came from the Culloden clan or whatever in that area. And they had a little bit of an exchange. But I like to tell that little story, not much of a story, because to me it illustrates the core, the heart, the essence of what narrative care is. Because he recognized in that brief exchange that here's a woman who has a name, who has a home, comes from a village, had a family, has a story that maybe had been shriveling up inside of her not because of where she was, but because those are busy places typically, and had lost perhaps some sense of her identity, her personal sense of self, because her story wasn't being asked about. But Dad had that connection with her, and I like to think that she had a good night's sleep that night, that the flame of her sense of personhood was fanned a bit more briskly, that she had even more positive encounters or exchanges with the staff. And anyway, I'm not telling the story terribly well, but that to me is the heart and core of what narrative care can be. So when we come back after a bit of a break, we'll wrap up by talking about what narrative care can be, how we can practice it, and all important, the idea of narrative self-care.
Okay, any questions, comments? I've got that.
I have a question, but I think it will probably come this second half. In just listening to that story though, about talking about where they're from, that is so. First of all, I've never heard anyone else mention Williamsburg. My family's from Williamsburg. My parents, my grandparents. I've never heard anyone else even know Williamsburg.
Yeah.
Impressed. But I think just those little stories, and the students, when we get to long-term care, you'll see that the person staring at the window or things like that, and being able to talk to them. I have learned so many things over my career as a nurse from, a dementia patient who is combative, but when I ask them, what do you do for a living? I've heard about people being riding the logs, delivering lunches down the Nashwauk River, and so many neat little stories that those people, you see them light up when they talk about those things. So I think those are that story about being at the nursing home and that person, your dad talking to that person, those little things mean so much to those residents, and we learn so much from them. It's a really neat and a real privilege to be able to spend that time with some of these residents.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think one of the most powerful opening questions you can ask somebody is, so where are you from? I think that kind of question, particularly here in the Maritimes, is a powerful question, because they may say, oh, I'm from Williamsburg. And chances are, you know somebody who knows somebody, and who has a connection in some way with that community or a neighboring community. And that can start a rapport that can lead to a wonderful connection with that patient, and a healing kind of connection as well. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Andrea usually laughs at me because my family's from out there, but I grew up in Devon, so I worked at the CVZ and I've worked at different places around. So it's shocking how many people I know through connections and things. And Andrea's always laughing. Her and another faculty member will be somewhere, and there's always somebody that I know, but it's from those outside connections. And it's really funny how many, when small rural areas in New Brunswick, how many people do know or have connections to those rural areas.
And same is true for PEI, for Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, for sure. But I like to think that, even in more metropolitan sort of areas like, Southern Ontario and so forth, those connections are still there potentially. You might have to dig a little bit more to identify them, but
I think the other piece is that there may be a lot of people, in our class who are not from here, and so might not know people who know people, kind of thing. But if you know the questions that to ask, and Bill, you said, well, so where are you from? I mean, that's a good place to start. And even though you don't know exactly where that is, or much about it, it'll give the person a chance to start telling their story.
Exactly. And if you say, gee, I'm not from this area, but tell me more about what life is like, where you grew up and so forth. And out come the stories typically. Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we come back at 11:05? We're doing really well with our symmetry here. So we came back at 10:05. We'll come back at 11:05, and we'll learn more about narrative care.
Okay.
Thanks so much. I'm going to keep the recording going because I don't want to stop it. That way I'll get 3 different recordings from Microsoft. So we'll have big, long pauses in our recording for those of you who might listen to it after.
Good idea.
Okay, I think I've got 11:05 on my computer, so we'll continue with the story.
Sure. Okay. That my slide come up okay there, did it?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, good. So, narrative care. I define it quite simply, folks, as listening closely, interestedly, and respectfully to, and maybe as important, for the stories by which people, in this case, older people, understand themselves. Because again, our stories and our identities are intimately entwined. So narrative care is not just one more thing to do if we have time, but it is, I believe, arguably as important as other forms of care that we dispense or that we provide in healthcare settings. Because it's about attitude as much as, if not more than, activity. It's about the quality of connection more than the quantity of time. Just that story about my father chatting with the woman from the Stanley area. It wasn't very long, but there was a quality to that connection that I think made a difference, not only in her life, but it certainly did in Dad's life. He felt good about making that connection with her. So it's about fostering a narrative environment with another person or people that is warm and inviting and healing. And it can be practiced between the lines. Sorry, of other activities. It can be adapted to different contexts, the emergency room, alternative level of care, long-term care, pastoral care, palliative care. I recall the night that my dad died, I was with him at the hospital in the ER, and I was blown away by just how kind and considerate and good-humored the nurse on duty that night with Dad was, and the doctor as well. They had lots of other patients they were attending too, but they grasped the situation and the emotional power that was involved in it, because it was clear that Dad was not going to come out of it. His organs were shutting down, so they left us to ourselves for a while, turned off dimmed the lights and turned off those machines that go beep, beep, beep. And Dad and I had a nice, sweet connection. But I noticed that Dad, because he was still conscious in his final hours, just had a nice connection with the nurse. She just seemed to know implicitly that this was a man who lived a full, rich life that he was at the end of. And she was able to kind of gently joke with him and so forth. And he always did like to joke around with people. So I give that as another little illustration of when he was on the receiving end of narrative care at the hands of this nurse. Now, I could say specifically about narrative care in working with people with depression, with dementia, and close to death. But if there's time, we could come back to those things. These are topics that are extremely important. But I do want to get to some practical things that we can look for, first off, in attempting to practice narrative care. Going into a person's room, and if they're a reader, you might say, well, what are the books or the magazines that they like to read? If it's outdoor life, then that tells us a little something about that person's story world and how they see themselves and what's of interest to them. If it's good housekeeping, that's a different story, perhaps. What sort of TV shows do they like watching? Archie Bunker, All in the Family, or sports, or what is it? Okay. What music do they like to listen to? Are they a jazz kind of a person? Or are they country and western, classical, somewhere in between, hymns? What, if any, pictures or mementos do they have? Because those can tell you something about what's important. Who visits them, if anybody? And what do they talk about, insofar as you can kind of be aware of that? What information is on their charts that gives you some sense of their jobs in the past, or the hobbies that they may have, or their affiliations, their family situation, and also looking for the stories that are conveyed by the looks in their eyes, the gestures, the posture, and so forth, because those tell stories. Our stories are embodied. Things we can listen for in practicing narrative care. I think we can listen for the signature stories that they may come out with. We can't know whether they're signature stories for them, but if once we've asked them, so where are you from? They start to tell us about growing up on the farm and with 13 brothers and sisters and so forth, and how they one day had to go and get the milk from the cow, etc. That may be one of their signature stories. That can be a kind of a window into their world. Maybe they had certain stories that are turning point stories about things that happened in their lives that pushed them or forced them to make major changes. Then there's a category that my colleague and friend from Norway, Oddgar Sinus, who's coming here to St. Thomas in the fall as a visiting chair in gerontology, he likes to talk about nostalgic stories. And these are stories that people might tell when they're close to death, and they're in palliative care, and they're not necessarily deep stories or stories with have complex plots to them. But yeah, I remember growing up outside of Bergen in Norway, and we used to like to go up on the hill above the fjord and have a picnic with the family, and I loved those times. Those might be the stories that take them back to positive memories of their life, and that's the sort of thing that Oddgar Sinus says we need to listen for. The shadow stories, the stories that are behind what we're hearing. Someone might say, oh yeah, well, my third husband, and then wait a second, 3 husbands? Not that you're going to ask necessarily, but to be aware that there's stories behind the stories. I'm going to go through some of these in black because I think they're important. You're listening for the facts, but also the feelings with which the facts are conveyed, and any recurring themes or telltale phrases. I had a teacher once whom I liked greatly because she thought I was a good student. So years later, it so happened that I had her in a class. I was teaching a course in the summer at UNB in the Masters of Education program, and she was a student in the class. Had gone back in her 50s or 60s, I think, to get her master's degree. So that was an interesting twist of fate. But I realized, because we had a session where we broke up into groups of 2 and 3, and we each got to tell some version of our story to our classmates and so forth. So it was an exercise in storytelling and story listening. I noticed a phrase that she used repeatedly in her 45 minutes of talking about her life. Somehow I managed to. Somehow I managed it. Somehow I managed to survive cancer. Somehow I managed to get through that divorce. Somehow I managed to raise 4 kids on limited income. Somehow I managed to drive from where she lived to the Harvey School every day. Somehow I managed to go back to do my master's degree. And I thought to myself, what an interesting phrase. It seemed like she didn't quite believe that she'd been doing all these things and accomplished all these things. Somehow I managed to. And we, as listeners, said, so intrigued by that phrase. Look at all you've accomplished. And it's like, I don't know, it's like she had a sense of herself as just kind of passively going along, when in fact the real story was that she'd accomplished so much. So I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but it's listening between the lines for to what the person is telling you about their sense of self, their story world. I have the phrase storying style. Can I tell you another quick story about my dad? When he was in his latter years, I would go to visit him at Windsor Court, which is a retirement home here in Fredericton, not a nursing home as such. And I felt it was my task as his son and as a narrative gerontologist to invite him to tell me again some of his stories about growing up as a kid in rural Nova Scotia, which he loved to do. He loved to tell stories. And I felt like that kind of brought him out of his kind of sadness or whatever he might be experiencing, and kind of reconnecting with himself. But I realized when he would tell stories about his life that he typically would position himself as the smart kid who, alone among the others in his class in the rural school he went to, knew how to deal with the bullies. and show them a thing or two. And then when he tells stories about other stages of his life, he would position himself not in a bragging kind of way, but in a kind of a matter-of-fact way. He was the one that knew that you needed to do this and not that. You needed to build it this way and not that way, and so forth. Again, not bragging, but he had a very strong sense of his own narrative agency, as came through his stories. The moment I realized that my storying style is quite different, that I tend to tell stories on myself, where I look kind of stupid or do dumb things or say dumb things. And it always brings a chuckle from my audience and so forth, or typically does. But it's a very different way of telling the stories of my life and positioning myself in the midst of the events that the stories are about. So, and I told you in the resilience study that we've been doing, the people who scored highest on resilience were the more likely to say, I've got a story to tell, or I want to write my story. So the question is, when we're listening to patients or residents, where are they in their stories, okay? What degree of narrative agency do they seem to have? And what larger narratives or what larger stories are really important for them or rooted in? If they talk a lot about their church or family, as if family was spelled with a capital F, you know that that's a very powerful and important story in their sense of who they are. What can we do? This is where we get down to some nitty-gritty sort of things. I think that we can stimulate narrative activity with our older patients and residents in lots and lots and lots of different ways, so many different ways. The York Care Center has had over the years quite an elaborate and very powerful narrative care strategy, which is to interview an older resident about his or her life at length using a particular resource such as I have here called Life Bio Memory Journal. And it contains all kinds of questions such as, what would you remember most about your brother or your sister? And describe your favorite subject in school, etc. These kinds of questions typically can start the narrative juices flowing. And then once the person's story has through the interviews has been gathered, then a video is made of 15 to 20 minutes in length, featuring some of the things that the person said during the interviews about themselves and their life. Their favorite music is playing in the background, and there are photographs from various stages of their life. And these videos are then shown in a public ceremony, which invariably leaves everybody moved and touched, and there's rarely a dry eye in the audience. I've been to a number of these myself. That's a very labor-intensive kind of narrative care intervention, but it has a tremendous impact on the culture of the place, the institution, often, and it has a ripple effect in terms of staff, resident interactions, staff, family interactions, and so forth. But there are a lot of other more less labor-intensive approaches as well. For example, when you go to the rooms of some residents in nursing homes, there sometimes can be a window box or a shadow box just as you're going in the door, and in that shadow box or window box, there are some mementos, maybe some medals from service in the military, some photographs. Piece of some memento or some item that obviously holds special significance to the individual who's in that room. So when you're going in to visit them or to do a nursing task with them, you might carry a question. So I was noticing that medal that's in your window box. What's that about? Oh, well, and then out comes the story perhaps about their military service or their war experience, etc. I do have a couple of quick videos. I hope we have time for those, because in the Nashwauk Villa, which is a smaller size but beautiful nursing home in Stanley, we were talking about Stanley and Williamsburg a little while back, they've instituted something called True Doors. And I think I have a 2-minute clip from CBC News that illustrates that. I'm going to try to activate that now. Hopefully it'll work, Betty. Shall we go? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So as you'll see what this entails. It's tailoring the doors to residents' rooms to their own unique life and their own unique interests and stories. I'm going to pray that this will work okay.
Oh, what, you'll have to, any suggestions, Andrea?
The volume?
The volume, and you may have to change which screen you're sharing.
Yeah, have to take your slides down, so stop screen sharing for your PowerPoint, Bill. I'll let you walk through, Andrea. That's as much as I know.
So,
If you click on the same button you did to share your screen,
yeah. Yeah.
and then it should come up. Sometimes it comes up with some options of which window you want to share.
Yes.
At the bottom. If you can choose the one that has a video playing within it.
One with the video playing in it.
It's the one with it, or a tab open that has a video playing.
I think I may have lost it. You know what? I actually closed the video, so I need to open it back up again. Oh dear. Okay. Sorry, folks. Apologize. I'm going to open up the.
They're used to dealing with me and Debbie and things happening, so it's quite all right.
I'll click on the link.
Yes.
Yes. And then I go and I.
Does it, when you click on the share button, does that open another window on your computer when you click on the link?
Yes.
Okay. So when you hit the share button and you look at the bottom, you'll have options.
Did that help?
Can you see the one with the video?
No, I can't.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
No, apologize. Darn.
If oh, I see it.
Yeah, it's there.
YouTube.
I'll go back to the start of it.
Yeah. You may need to turn the volume up as well. Oh, okay.
As high as I can go, I'm afraid.
Okay. No, the volume's not working, unfortunately.
You can't hear anything?
No.
That would be about sharing the sound on the computer, right? And who needs to do that, Bill?
Yes.
Share the sound.
Do you know how to do that, Debbie? To go up to the ellipses, maybe, in device settings.
Beside your mute button there with that little rectangle with the X through it, go into that, and then it'll give you all these options like desktop, window, whiteboard. You have to just click the include computer sound. Should be an option right in there for you.
Yeah, I pressed that.
Okay, now you should be okay if you go back and try the video. Just keep in mind now you are no longer sharing your screen though. You have to click share your screen and include computer sound at the same time.
Thank you, Alexandria.
No worries.
That didn't help, I'll say. I mean, I don't think I was able to. I'm overwhelmed.
That's
You
it.
can't, you can't see the video?
No, you'd have to go back in and now share your screen again. Because we can just see you.
So the rectangle with the arrow, you want it to be, to hit that. Yeah.
You see?
Okay, well, so much for that. Thanks for your help. I apologize for not being able to, yeah,
You know what? If
dear.
I could do is I'll locate it and then locate a link to the video, and then I can share it from mine because I'm quite confident that the sound will work from mine.
Okay.
Just give me a moment if you want to talk for a moment, then I'll let you know when I find it.
Sure. You can't see the slide though now, can you?
No, so you just have to hit your slide presentation at the bottom of your screen there, Bill, or bottom of your desktop. This has happened to all of us, so it's no worries, and we've got extremely patient and understanding audience for sure. So it's awesome. Yeah. Okay. Great. We're back to your slides.
Okay. I don't know if you can see me now, folks, but I have in my hand here a little box that I got given to me at what's the name of that? Across from Shanex here in Fredericton, there's a special care home or a retirement home. What's it called? St. Anne's Court. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
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 Anyway, I went there. I was talking about these ideas to some of the residents there. And as a gift, they gave me a box called Storywise, which is consists of a whole bunch of cards. And each card has a picture. And this is a picture, a black and white picture of a postman. And on the other side says, share a story, a special letter you received. So the box is filled with all kinds of little cards like that. Each one has a picture that starts a memory going usually. And this picture here is somebody looking in the mirror at themselves. And the card says, a night that you looked your best. So these, as you can imagine, are great story starters, okay? So I'm not saying that it's easy to implement this when you're doing specific medical tasks like taking blood pressure, etc. But as a way of, if you have time to spend a little bit more of a connection with somebody, that could be a fun thing to do, okay? It's called Storywise. As I say, window boxes, I was going to show the video called Alive Inside, but it might have to postpone that. I think any sort of activities that prompt people to talk about their lives, anything from, where are you from, to tell me about your family, whether did you have a lot of brothers and sisters. Scrapbooking is an activity that a lot of people of all different ages are involved in these days. There are scrapbooking clubs, apparently. There's a scrapbooking section at local stores where you can get scrapbooking supply. I think that's an excellent way of working with an individual to help so that they can celebrate and see just how rich and interesting their story and the stories of their families are. Obviously, a lot of older people nowadays are turning to writing their memoirs. There is a woman named Vivian Edwards here in Fredericton who attended a workshop that I gave and decided to start a life writing group. And it's been going on for like 3 or 4 years now. And once a month, 30, 40 people gather to share stories that they have written about their lives, about particular events and so forth. And I have these folks come to talk to my class, and they inspire the students greatly because these older adults are having a great time. You know, not necessarily, it isn't a creative writing class where there's some standard of quality that they have to feel they have to achieve, but they're having an opportunity to write about some of the funny, some of the interesting, some of the more difficult stories of their lives, and in that way, starting to appreciate just how interesting and full their lives have truly been. Simple reminiscence activities of various sorts, or just plain old conversation. And the picture down the lower right-hand corner shows a nurse and an elderly male patient just having some quiet conversation. I had a nurse come up to me after a presentation I made on these things in Prince Edward Island, and she said, "Thank you so much for underscoring the importance of narrative care," because she says, "I like to spend time with my patients in my residence where I work, but I get criticized by some of my coworkers for spending too much time with the patients." And she says, "I feel that it's time well spent because it establishes a connection that can maybe save time and save difficulties further on down the line in interacting with that patient." So what are some of the benefits of life storytelling and life story listening? I think there are numerous, and there are many people better qualified than myself who've done research to identify some of these benefits. A decrease in anxiety and stress and depression. Our Dutch colleagues Ernst Bollmeyer and Herman Westerhoff and others have done a lot of work documenting how taking older adults through some form of life review or life review therapy, in the case where they might be experiencing some mild or moderate depression, perhaps due to narrative foreclosure, that activity can kind of open their stories back up again. And with that happening, there's a decrease in their sense of depression, of anxiety, of stress. James Pennebaker from the University of Texas, through his research with university students, inviting them to write about some difficult experiences that they've had in their journals, found that, among other things, their immune system was improved. And I don't have the details of how that works or how their immune systems would be benefited through writing about their lives, but he believes that there is a definite connection between physical healing and story work. Improved sense of connection to oneself and to other people. Daphne Noonan, who is now the executive director at Nashwauk Villa, has written a wonderful chapter, which I have here somewhere. Yes, it's called The Ripple Effect, the story of the transformational nature of narrative care, which she wrote about the narrative care program at York Care Center. And she documents how there's a connection that develops between the interviewer and the older adult resident whose life story is explored through these various kinds of questions. There's a increased connection often between the resident, him or herself, and his or her family members, because oftentimes to kind of complete the story, you go ask the daughter or the son, "Can you tell me a little bit more about, about your mother's experience growing up," or whatever, and increased connections between Daphne. She talks about in this chapter about the increased connection that she had with the residents themselves and how that played a part when the resident ultimately died. The fact that the resident's story had been taken and the video had been done of them meant so much to the family members themselves. So another benefit, I think, is of inviting somebody to tell stories about their lives, is that it can permit the person a kind of an affectionate detachment from some of the events in their lives that might otherwise be troubling or limiting or imprisoning. So you can see here that a number of the tasks that I talked about earlier in my presentation are tasks that some some form or some application of narrative care can help older adults to tackle. So I just kind of want to wrap up here and leave some more time for discussion. So a few things to kind of round off my time with you first of all, I want to say that narrative care is not rocket science. I do not mean by that it's simple or easy. It takes a special range of skills and quality of connection with people. And for people who are experts in narrative care, like counselors and therapists that do this for a full-time job, a lot of skill, a lot of training goes into that. But I think, nonetheless, I think of narrative care as an umbrella that has sort of therapy on one end and just conversation on the other, and includes kind of everything in between. And I think that you could argue that narrative care, compared to the tests and the drugs and various technological interventions that we need to make in people's lives to improve their health, narrative care is not wildly expensive. It's emotional care, spiritual care, and patient-centered care kind of all in one. And ultimately, it's not a task as much as it is a relationship. And I think, as that nurse in PEI kind of attested, a little bit can go a long way. It's not therapy per se, but it does have a therapeutic impact and can help older people, older residents, patients, and so forth to deal with some of the developmental tasks and challenges of later life that I identified earlier. It's potentially transformative, not just for patients or residents, but for us as caregivers. And one of the speakers earlier there, I can't remember, you're from the Stanley area. You talked about how you learn so much. You learn so much as you listen to the patients and residents with whom you work. I think an important thing to keep in mind is that you can potentially become a key character in, and maybe a co-author of, an older adult's final chapters. The PSWs who work with mother to help her get up in the morning, get to bed at night, do this, do that. She's developed a relationship with them. There's one in particular who likes the music of John Denver, particularly that song, Annie's song. You fill up my senses. Well, mother has an Alexa device. I have one too, but I don't dare say her name, otherwise she'll leap into life here, Alexa. But mother, whenever Megan, I think her name is, comes in to help mother get ready for bed, mother asks Alexa to play Annie's song.
I'm not sure.
Alexa, stop. Sorry. Mother will ask Alexa to play John Denver's song, and it just solidifies the connection and the friendship that mother and Megan have. So I like to say that narrative care is core care because it goes to the heart, or the cœur, as the French would say, of who a patient is as a person. And it's what attracts many of us into helping professions, whether it's ministry, medicine, nursing, in the first place. And I'll close off by stressing, however, that narrative care begins at home, by which I mean narrative self-care. You folks are preparing for a marvelous, powerfully important career of helping and healing. And that will involve, I believe, I hope you'll find, a narrative dimension. So appreciating just how complex and interesting other people's stories, your patient's stories are, requires or involves you appreciating just how complex and rich and interesting your own story is as well. I had a student some years ago in my narrative gerontology class, and I had been getting them to do various reflection exercises to stimulate discussion about the topics in the course. And she announced to the rest of the class at the beginning of one particular session, she said, you know what? Through all these different reflection exercises, I'm starting to appreciate the mystery in my story. I like puns, and I thought that was a beautiful pun, that she could, the mystery in my story. To appreciate the mystery in Mrs. Smith's age 95 story, it's helped if we can appreciate and honor the mystery in our own stories too. So narrative self-care involves nurturing our relationship with and a reflection upon some of our own life, doing some form of personal story work, as I call it, through journaling, through reflecting on our signature stories. And yes, it's probably time here to tell you briefly my iron lung story. But there's a variety of ways in which we can engage in story work to enrich our relationship with and our honoring of our own stories, even if we're only 20. So I've got some various images here that show ways in which we can nurture that respect for our own story. Because when we listen to someone else's story, inevitably it touches something within us. There's a connection. We can appreciate what they're telling us because it echoes with or resonates with something that we too have gone through. So the more we know about what we too have gone through and the sense we've made of what we've gone through, the better I think it helps us to be as listeners. But can I tell you my iron lung story? Okay, when I was 2 years of age, I had polio, as did my other two sisters. Carol, permanently disabled because of polio. That was the COVID of those times, back in the 50s. For two weeks, because I had polio of the diaphragm, which means I had really difficult time breathing on my own, I was placed in an iron lung for 2 weeks. This was in St. John Hospital, the old St. John Hospital, the one that was imploded. A new one was eventually built nearby. Now that's kind of all the story is I was in an iron lung for 2 weeks. I just have a memory of kind of being there by myself in this room with this big machine. I could see the fog outside the window. That's pretty much it. But I've told this story, which I think of as one of my signature stories, many times over the years. Whenever the conversation turns to life-threatening illnesses that we've had and recovered from, I come out with my iron lung story. There's only one little problem. The problem is there was no iron lung, or at least I wasn't in it. Somehow, and I found this out 40 years later, talking to my parents one time when I said, it must have been tough for you, and we all had polio, and this was before Medicare was as we know it nowadays, and times were tough. Oh yeah, those are tough times. And then I was in the iron lung for 2 weeks. Mother says, what are you talking about? You were never in an iron lung. Where'd you get that idea? She said, you were in an oxygen tent for a while, and you had Vicks VapoRub or whatever the equivalent was in the 1950s rubbed on your chest so you could breathe a little better, but you were never an iron lung. I thought, oh my goodness, I got to go back to all those people and all those parties and all those events where I've told my little iron lung story, feeling very good about myself, being in an iron lung at age 2, and tell them it ain't so. Anyway, that's a signature story with a twist, because a lot of times within the special stories that we tell about our lives or our childhood, there's a mythical element. And if you reflect on your own signature stories, and you each have your own set, you sometimes can come up with some amusing and insightful insights into, what are important themes in your life. My need to kind of portray myself as this little kind of child hero in an iron lung. Actually, I realized that iron lung story has been a source of strength for me. And I was annoyed when Mother and Dad ripped the iron lung part of it away from me, but at least I still have the story. It's not quite true. It's not quite true historically, but it's true narratively, I think you could argue. Anyway, I think I've probably gone on enough, folks, and I'm going to pause here. Sorry about the video thing. That's my fault. My bad. So comments, concerns, connections. And I do want to say, take narrative care of yourselves.
Were you able to get the video going? Do we want to go there? Or did you just want to do?
I can, but I'm wondering if Bill would rather watch video or have discussion.
Is there any way that folks can watch the videos on their own time? They're very short ones.
Mm-hmm. I can post the links, and yeah, definitely I'll put it right in the chat, and then they can watch it.
There are 2 videos on that one slide.
Yes, the Alive Inside and
Yes.
the True Doors.
Correct. Yep.
So Bill, if you want to stop sharing your screen, then we can get you up. Like you can be the person on the screen.
How do I stop sharing my screen?
So just the rectangle with the arrow again. Up top.
I'm on the wrong screen, sorry. There.
There you go. Yay.
Okay. Becky Fullerton. Yes.
And I have a question if no one else is going to jump in quick with a question. And it came that very first, one of the very first comments that you made about every time an old person dies, it's like a library burns. And I have been very fortunate to be very close to my grandparents, my great grandparents, and right now my dad is my library. So my son came home Remembrance Day all eager, and he keeps seeing the ancestry.ca video or commercials. So Ben's always asking me about his ancestors, and at Remembrance Day his teacher did a fabulous job explaining war, and he came home asking me all these questions about his ancestors who fought in the war. So of course I said, well, we need to call Grandpa. So, and thinking about all this now, I'm really, how do we encourage those libraries in our lives to write their story? And not see it as my sister, and the reason I asked that is my sister bought my grandmother a book years before she passed away, and it was a book she got at Chapters, and it asked my grandmother key questions like, what was your favorite childhood Christmas memory and your earliest memory, and all these questions. And my grandmother laughed and said to my sister, you must think I'm not going to last very long. And we said, no, Grammy, it's because we want these stories to pass on. So how do we encourage those libraries in our lives to write those stories for us and for future generations?
Well, I brought along, this is one, I don't know if you can see the cover of it terribly well. It's called The Book of Me, a do-it-yourself memoir. And I'm not sure where I got it, but it's like you say, Becky, it's each page has 2 or 3 questions that could prime the memory pump. Lots of people, older people perhaps, are reluctant to write things down because they're conscious of they're not writers, or they'll get the punctuation or the spelling wrong, or maybe there's some functional illiteracy at work and so forth. So we can work with such people using these kinds of resources. You tell me a story and I'll write it down. So that's one way. Then there's a simple approach here called listography. I don't know if you can see that terribly well. Your life in lists. Somebody made a lot of money off of a very simple idea. Each page has a picture that kind of prompts. There's a picture of a squirrel drinking alcohol for some reason. Anyway, so list the websites that you visit most. Oh dear. List the things that you'd save if your home was on fire. These are kind of random sort of prompts that will prime the memory pump, as I say. These are not necessarily list your hobbies, past and present. So you just list in point form. You don't have to go into some fancy English composition. Yeah. And then there are resources out there, like when my students do life story interviews with older adults as part of the course I teach, they have the opportunity, if the person they interview agrees, to have their video storytelling session put on NB Voices, which is a website that you can access through Greater Fredericton Social Innovation. Or you can just type in NB Voices, and you'll see real people from New Brunswick talking about some aspect of their life. And so those people who aren't really keen to write or feel self-conscious about writing may be open to them, to being you videoing them. Grampy, going to bring my cell phone and my little camera that's in it by on Saturday afternoon. We'll get the coffee pot going, and I want you to tell me about, as much as you'd like to, about what it was like growing up in Williamsburg. So that's there's, and this little box of story cards. you could have a whole fun family afternoon, and oftentimes the stories flow when people don't feel like they have to produce a quality oral or written product, but if they're just in a lighthearted kind of way, that's when the stories often flow the most freely, isn't it? And if you have a tape recorder running with the person's permission, my sister does that, or used to do that when mom and dad were both alive, and it's neat the things you can capture that way.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Bill? I think you've given us a number of good ideas for how we can approach developing a relationship with some of the residents for whom we'll care in the various long-term care facilities that we're going to, and Nashwauk Villa being one of them. So for those of you going to Nashwauk Villa, it sounds like you're really lucky. You've got a great environment to go into.
And the reason that would be a great environment is because the interest in and the respect for stories runs through all levels of the institution, from Daphne Noonan, the executive director, who obviously has that. That's a huge part of what she views caring for people is about. And so when you have that institutional buy-in, then there's a greater chance that spending time with a resident and having them tell you some of their stories is viewed not as a just a frill activity, but as a vitally important part of the healing atmosphere.
Yeah, and York Care Center, for those going to York Care Center, the videos that Bill mentioned, their activity director usually shows one of those videos during our orientation day. And anyone who's there with me, I'll admit, I will not have dry eyes. I have yet to get through one with dry eyes, and I don't even know the people. So they usually do show one, and you'll see the power of just how moving those videos can be.
So, sorry, do one of those videos under Daphne Noonan at my position at the Nashwauk Villa this summer, and it was really nice to get close with. It was a family member that I ended up being able to do it on, so it was super
wow.
to hear more about her story and pull it all together.
You did the video and everything.
We sent it off. We did the book. Yeah, I guess I did do a video too, but
Wow.
yeah.
So someone said here in the chat, Annika says, I thought that many of the developmental tasks of later life could be applied to my own story, even as a young person.
Yes, I think that's wise comment, because we're always at all ages developing narratively, and we can get stuck at certain stages, in a premature form of narrative foreclosure. And to keep our stories open, that can be challenging at certain times. Which is why I think just thinking of your own life as a story does give you that little bit of affectionate, gently ironic detachment from the stuff of your life, and in my case with the students, helps them to appreciate that whatever difficult things they're going through right now is not the whole story. It's a chapter, it's a page, but the page will eventually turn, and the chapter will give way to another chapter. And you'll look back on that previous page or previous chapter and say, well, you know what? It was tough, but I'm glad I went through it because now I understand things from a broader perspective.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got someone else who knows Williamsburg. Brooke lives close to Williamsburg and Cross Creek, so that's another link. And I think Brooke's going to Nashwauk Villa, so that's all good. Nikki, I think that allowing their story to be told also benefits us, as it gives us a sense of fulfillment and impacts our story and allows us to build that client-nurse relationship on a deeper level.
Wow.
And then, yeah, Michaela, there's a lady at a long-term care facility I did my co-op at, who I discovered was friends with my grandmother, and she loved telling me stories of the gang when they were younger. So seeing your grandmother as part of the gang is quite neat. So, okay, yeah, then there's immunization story or question that we can deal with. Alexandria, so it could be really beautiful when speaking to nonverbal clients or persons living with dementia to see their eyes light up and see their stories written all over their face when you speak about a certain place that they perhaps know well or grew up in. And Alexandria had a client once with progressive dementia whom couldn't really converse anymore, but anytime that you said the word Stanley, his eyes would light up and you could see him return to the world a little bit in that moment just because he used to work in Stanley. So picture of a memory box or a shadow box that Sean shared. So thank you, Sean. Yeah, so we've had a conversation going on now while you were presenting there, Bill. So thanks to all of you for sharing your thoughts today. Anything else before we wrap up? Well, Bill, I think I could, for one, listen to your stories and to your experiences, around narrative gerontology, narrative care, and all the different aspects of it for the whole entire day, I know. But we're looking forward to implementing some of the strategies that you've shared with us today when we start in clinical with the people who live in long-term care. And I think, to have a conversation with our clinical groups once we've had the experience of actually providing narrative care or engaging in narrative care, then that will be really, really, interesting and important. So thank you so very much for sharing your morning with us. And, you've got a number of publications that you've written and books, and looking forward to delving into those for sure. So thanks so much, and enjoy continuing to tell and I guess write and experience your own story, as will we.
Well, thank you very much, Debbie and Andrea and Becky and all of you. And I wish you very, very best. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about things that I get really excited about, as maybe you can tell. And I sense from your comments and questions that you get it. And I know that the world's going to be a better place because you get it. So
yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I feel you did extremely well, changing the accents and entertaining us. And I know it's very difficult when we don't have our cameras on, but there were definitely chuckles from my end, and I thought you did a really good job of it.
Thank you, SG.
That's awesome. Thank you. All right, so we're back at 1:30, I think, today to work on hygiene lab, and so that's so everyone have a good break, and we'll see you back at 1:30. Thanks, Bill. Take care.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
I got an email that said that we don't start till 2:30.
Pardon me, sorry.
I think I got an email that said that we don't start till 2:30.
1:30 to 3:30 is the time frame I think we have today.
That might be for lab tomorrow.
It's hard to keep all those labs straight, for sure.
Yeah, the hygiene lab today for clinical is 1:30, and the health assessment lab for tomorrow is 2:30.
And then you've probably got a physiology one thrown in there sometimes, so I can appreciate why it's confusing. Yes. So see everyone back at 1:30.
Andrea.
Yes.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Are we going to be going over the questions on the quizzes after they close, I guess?
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
Definitely can. Yeah.
Great. I just had a question about one of them, so I just wanted to check in on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Remind me, Megan.
I will. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Hello.
Hi, Rachel. How are you?
Yeah, good. How are you?
Good. I had a little chuckle of your picture with the chicken on your shoulder.
Yeah,
Love
that's chicken.
I love it. Is that your own chicken?
Yep.
Okay. Did you want to talk about your question now?
Yeah. So I
Fire
could get
away.
my varicella shot today, but it's at like 1:45.
Right. Okay, so yes, the lab is counted as clinical time, but you do need to get your vaccination completed. Where are you getting it done at the Student Health Center or
I'm getting done at a travel clinic in Moncton.
in Moncton? Okay. Right. Okay.